woman in the white dress. Every year, my friend Darren's family threw a New Year's Eve party at their large home on the outskirts of town. Darren lived in a wealthy neighborhood tucked deep in the woods, accessible only through narrow, dark country roads. The road leading to his house, particularly the part surrounded by dense forests and overgrown trees, always gave me an unsettling feeling. The trees formed dark shadows at night, and despite the full moon, the road was always soaked in an eerie, almost impenetrable blackness. That night, I drove my old car down that lonely road, illuminated only by my headlights. I turned on my brights, even though I usually hated using them, just to try and combat the oppressive darkness. The sound of gravel crunching under my tires mixed with the howling wind as I pushed onward. As I neared the abandoned shack that always stood out like a reminder of the eerie isolation in the area, my headlights briefly flickered across a shape, a figure standing by the side of the road. My breath caught. There was a woman, standing eerily still in a white gown. Her back was turned to me, facing the dense trees. She wasn't moving or doing anything at all, just standing there in the darkness, as though waiting for something. There was something about her that made my stomach tighten. Why was she standing out there in the cold, with no other cars or people around for miles? The reflection from my headlights obscured her features, but I could see the shape of her white dress against the dark backdrop of the forest. I held my breath as I passed her, relieved she didn't step out into the road, causing me to stop. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, something made my skin crawl. The woman had turned her body toward my car, standing frozen in place, just watching me. Her eyes. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. As my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, I couldn't help but wonder. Who was she? Had she wandered out there lost, or was she a party guest who got disoriented? No, it didn't feel right. She didn't belong there. Shaking the thought away, I reached Darren's house without further incident. The festivities were in full swing as I joined the gathering. After the clock struck midnight and we'd watched the ball drop, the party began to die down as always. Around 2 a.m., after helping clean up, I finally left Darren's house. It was late, and I was exhausted. When I got in the car, however, I was greeted with the flashing warning of low tire pressure on my dashboard. Figuring it was just the cold air after the warmer weather we'd been having, I ignored the warning. But the tires weren't just low, they were almost completely flat. But there was nothing I could do at that point. The ride back down that same dark road was my only choice, despite the chill running down my spine. Something about that road, about that drive, felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the image of the woman standing there, staring at me. The familiar bumps in the road as I began my journey seemed amplified by the sound of grinding metal, the unmistakable noise of tires scraping against the road. I cursed under my breath and brought the car to a stop, heart racing. Something wasn't right, and my body was already telling me to get the hell out of there. I stepped out of the car, my breath pluming in the cold, and felt a sudden, strange stillness. There was no rustling wind, no animal noises, just silence, an unnerving kind of silence. My flashlight barely broke the darkness as I scanned the tires. And that's when I saw it. Every single tire had been ripped to shreds, not by some sharp object, but with the forceful strength of claws, big, jagged slashes in the rubber, as if something wild had torn them apart. I froze. There was no other car around for miles. Who could have done this? Who would even want to do this? Then I heard it. A twig snapping from somewhere in the dark, deep within the woods. The silence that had gripped the air shifted, and a sense of unease washed over me. Something was there, moving. Was it an animal? Or was it something worse? A whisper broke through the stillness, quiet at first, almost soothing but with an underlying malice. I see you. My heart stopped. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the air. The very air felt thick, suffocating. I turned off my phone's flashlight, praying that somehow I wouldn't draw attention to myself. But in the pitch black, I could feel the gaze of something, someone. A rustling noise grew louder, closer. Something or someone was creeping toward me, step by step. The terrifying realization hit me all at once. I was being hunted. I see you. The voice again, much louder this time, coming from somewhere not far behind me. Soft, chilling, familiar. Then, from the dark edge of the tree line, I saw her. The woman from before, the one in the white dress. Her pallid face came into view. It was horrifying. Her hair, matted and gray, hung loosely in tangled strands, her skin unnaturally white and cold as stone. But it was her face. Half of her jaw was missing, leaving a jagged and exposed bone. Her face looked wrong, like it had been stitched back together improperly, her grin stretched unnaturally wide as if trying to bear a monstrous, wicked smile. She stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes, not a single word spoken as she continued to grin that terrible grin. I didn't even think, pure instinct kicked in, and I bolted, running away from her down the road as fast as I could. My breath was ragged, panic coursing through my veins. But I heard her, the sounds of twigs snapping. She was following me. I sprinted towards Darren's house, not caring how foolish I seemed, just wanting to escape her grasp. My legs burned, but the sense of something cold, cruel chasing me drove me faster. I arrived back at the house, panting, my heart hammering. I pounded on the door until it opened. Darren's mother ushered me inside immediately, her eyes wide as she took in my frazzled appearance. "They tried to get me," I stammered. I couldn't make sense of it, but she seemed to know what I was talking about. The next morning, Darren's father and the police combed the area. They found something chilling in the yard near the house, a rusty knife with jagged edges. The same kind of slashing damage had been done to the tires. The woman had tracked me, followed me back to the party, and had been waiting. The police searched the abandoned shack I had passed earlier, but they found no one inside. Yet, all around the shack, they found gutted wildlife, bloody carcasses strewn about in the surrounding woods. Nothing that would explain who or what the woman truly was. She was never found. I've been to Darren's house for New Year's Eve parties since. I always drive with a friend, never alone. I never venture near those dark, twisted roads alone anymore, especially at night. That woman, whoever she was, still lives in my nightmares. The strange part? No one else remembers seeing her that night. But I know what I saw. I felt what I saw. And I will never forget her ghastly face or the whispers in the dark. Something out there still watches. The creepy taxi ride home. It was 2:30 a.m. when I stepped out of the office building, dragging my exhausted body onto the empty streets of downtown. The air felt heavy, tinged with the cold breath of autumn. I'd just finished an incredibly stressful meeting, and the weight of the world seemed to be pressing against my shoulders. The night felt oppressive, as if the world had drawn the curtains, and I was the only one left inside it. I checked my phone for any signs of movement in the city. Usually at this time, the roads were dotted with taxis, waiting for the next rider. But all I saw were the dim flickers of streetlights casting elongated shadows on the pavement. I stood at the corner for a while, hands jammed deep into my jacket pockets, my feet shifting nervously. Every passing car felt like an eternity as I waited, hoping one would stop for me. As the minutes dragged on, I became increasingly impatient. But then I saw it, a set of headlights in the distance. A yellow taxi, moving slowly but steadily toward me, cutting through the empty street like a lone predator. I stepped forward, waving a hand. The cab's brakes screeched as it came to a halt beside me. The driver, an unremarkable middle-aged man with unkempt brown hair and tired eyes, glanced up from his rearview mirror and opened the door. "Where to?" His voice was dry, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. It wasn't harsh, but it was peculiar enough to stand out. I climbed into the back seat, leaning my head against the cool window. "Just take me home," I muttered, already zoning out, my eyelids heavy. I had a short ride ahead of me, only a few miles, but in my tired state, it felt like the longest journey. The cab began moving, the hiss of the engine and the hum of the tires on asphalt filling the quiet space between us. For a moment, everything was normal. The night outside slid past us, quiet and calm, like a forgotten memory. But then things began to feel off. The first hint was the silence. Usually taxi drivers talk about the weather, the traffic, anything to pass the time. But he wasn't saying a word. His hands gripped the steering wheel with an unnerving intensity, and his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to tiredness, but my unease grew with every passing minute. It felt like the space inside the car had become too confined, like it was closing in around me. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to focus on the rhythm of the ride. I took a deep breath. "You work the late shift?" I asked, hoping to spark a conversation. The driver's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes," he said in a voice so soft, it was almost drowned out by the hum of the engine. "Late-night drives, they can be peaceful." I wasn't sure if it was his odd tone or the fact that we had driven further than usual, but suddenly, I felt a little too exposed. Every time I looked up, I caught a glimpse of him watching me through the rearview mirror. My skin tingled uncomfortably, my nerves bristling at the sensation of his eyes, dark and hollow, fixated on me. And yet, There was something strange in his gaze. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes conveyed something wrong. A small shiver of fear snaked down my spine. "How long have you been driving, if you don't mind me asking?" "Long enough," he replied, a cryptic edge in his voice. "But I don't mind the company. You're quiet. You seem different." I frowned at his words. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed the way the shadows seemed to hang around his face, as though the interior of the taxi wasn't just dark, it was swallowing the light. He was fading into the darkness. Or was he fading? Suddenly, I felt the tension in the car shift. The air inside, already stale, had become almost thick. The silence stretched between us like an unspoken word, its weight pressing against my chest. "Are you okay?" I asked, hoping it was the right thing to say, something to relieve the mounting pressure that was building. But the only answer I received was a low, unsettling laugh. It wasn't natural. It sounded more like a raspy gasp than genuine amusement. I looked at the driver, who, to my horror, was still smiling at me through the rearview mirror, but his grin seemed a little too wide, a little too unnerving. "You seem so alive," he said, his voice low, just shy of a whisper. His words didn't make sense, and I stared at him in confusion, my eyes blinking rapidly. There was something not right about his presence, his behavior, his words. I glanced out the window in an attempt to shake the strange feeling overwhelming me, but what I saw made my blood run cold. We weren't on the usual street. There were no familiar landmarks. In fact, the road outside was unfamiliar, an isolated street lined with decaying houses. A wet fog was curling around the buildings, giving everything a sickly, ethereal glow. The world outside the taxi was dark, shifting, like it wasn't real. I couldn't bring myself to turn away from the window, but somehow, in my peripheral vision, I noticed the driver's reflection again. He wasn't right. There was a dim light in his eyes now, no longer tired, but dark. Too dark. A deep black void seemed to swallow all the light of the cab, leaving his eyes empty. I could feel his gaze piercing through me, and it made my skin crawl. I turned my attention back to the street. The fog swirled thicker, denser around the cab. My heart began to thump wildly in my chest. Something wasn't right. I couldn't even recognize the area anymore. "Where are we going?" I croaked, my throat dry as dust. The driver didn't answer immediately. But then, with a calm, hollow tone, he spoke. "You're home," he whispered. A jolt of dread shot through me. No, this wasn't my neighborhood. I could hear it now, the silence of the streets that was deeper than anything I'd ever known. There were no lights beyond the faint glow of the taxi. Not a single soul in sight. No houses, no people walking the streets. Just nothing. I slammed my hand against the window, desperately trying to unlock it. The window remained shut, the glass unyielding, as if mocking me. "That's not my home." I cried out, my voice cracked. "Stop the car. Please." I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The driver didn't respond. He didn't have to. The car suddenly veered off the road into a narrow, dark alley where the lights appeared to flicker and fade out entirely. For a split second, I saw her. A figure. A woman. Her pale face barely visible in the pitch-black shadows, but her cold, lifeless eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. Her lips curled upward in a twisted smile as she leaned closer to the window. Before I could scream or even think to move, the world around me distorted. It was as though I was slipping, falling through cracks in reality, sinking into a place that shouldn't exist. My phone screen flickered to life for a brief moment, just a second, and in that reflection, I saw him again, the driver, but this time his eyes were not human. With a desperate scream, I opened the door and bolted out into the mist. Everything faded into darkness, but I could hear the sound of the taxi's engine revving faintly following me. And in the deepest parts of my mind, a single thought remained. I should have never gotten in. What you've just heard is only the beginning. The real story awaits. Don't miss it. Can you imagine this happening to you? Stay tuned for the next chilling tale. Here's a question for you. If you were in their shoes, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. This was a story no one dared to tell. But in the next episode, we'll dive into something even more terrifying. Don't miss out. This isn't the end. The next story will be even more haunting. Until then, stay safe and keep watching True Horror Unveiled. If this story gave you chills, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Want more stories like this? Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to True Horror Unveiled. You won't regret it. The next story might just keep you up at night. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Like this story? Give it a thumbs up and join our community by subscribing. We've got many more haunting tales coming your way. Every like and subscribe helps us uncover more chilling stories. Hit that button and be part of the journey.